Uh, okay, so thank you so much, and thank you to the organizers for this opportunity. So I'm Prashant, and I work in statistical physics, and I'm going to talk about stochastic resetting. And unlike many of the previous talks, I think this will mostly be a review talk. Okay, so I'll begin with something that I believe all of us are familiar with, Newton's laws of motion. So it says that if I know what the initial state of the particle is, and if I know what the forces acting on this particle is, then I can predict what the future state is going to be. And it's given in terms of this equation here. This is a good description when there are single particle or few particles, but it becomes a difficult description when there are large number of particles, say of the order of Avogadro number. Because then one obviously has to keep track of all the forces acting on this particle. Then what people usually do is people usually write an effective equation for this rate particle here. And in the context of diffusion of colloids, one can write such effective equation, and it's called the Langevin equation here. And it's very much similar to the Newton's second law here, but there are some additional contributions which comes because of the fact that this rate particle is interacting with the surrounding particles. So the first is the damping effect here, because it's moving in presence of other particles, so there will be damping effect. And the second term is because this system is in non-zero temperature, so there will be thermal vibrations, and the effect of those vibrations on the dynamics of this rate particle is essentially taken care by this blue term here. And this eta term here is a random term, which is chosen to be Gaussian with this sort of correlation here. In situations where this damping effect is large compared to the inertial term, then I can ignore this inertial term here. And also if the particle is free, if there's no force acting on this particle, then I can drop this potential term here, and I can rewrite this entire thing in this simple form here. So this is the celebrated Brownian motion in the overdamped limit. Okay, so if you solve this equation numerically, due to the fact that this is a random term, you get different answers depending on how many times you repeat. And instead of asking where the particle is, a more sensible question to ask is, what is the probability of finding the particle at some instance? And for this particular model, it is well known that this distribution to find particle at position x at time t, starting from x0, it has this Gaussian kind of form here. X0 is the initial position. And if you plot this, it has this kind of form. And as you increase, the particle will explore the farther ends of your space. So, the distribution, the width of this distribution essentially increases with time. But one key observation about this system is that the distribution is always in the transient state. If you increase time, it will keep on changing. It doesn't go to any steady state. So this is the first observation that I would like to emphasize, that for a Brownian motion in an infinite line, there's no steady state. Another related quantity for random processes is called first passage time. Basically, you have a random walker which is performing some dynamics, and you're interested in knowing what is the time starting from this position x0, the particle reaches the target here. So this time is known as first passage time in the literature. And since the motion is random, this time is also going to be random, and one is interested in the statistical properties of this time. And for Brownian motion, this is another well-known result, that the distribution of this time pf, the first passage time, starting from some position x0, has this power law kind of decay. And if you compute the mean diverges, which essentially means a Brownian walker will on average take infinite time to find a target. So this is the second observation, that is the power law decay for distribution of TF, which leads to diverging mean. Okay, so this is basically a search process. The particle is searching for some target. And this sort of search processes appear quite ubiquitously. For example, organisms forage, they go around looking for food. In biological context, one has proteins, which are looking for binding sites in DNA molecules. And in chemical reactions, where you have two diffusing particles, they react when they come together. The first encounter time basically tells you what the efficiency of the reaction is. And there are several other examples of this sort of search process. And one question which could be of practical interest is, can we minimize this search time? Because this will directly affect the efficiency of the search process. So, it would be interesting to know, is there a way to minimize the search time? and there are various strategies that people have proposed, and in this talk I'm going to talk about one such strategy. It turns out that resetting a system to some pre-selected state achieves this. It minimizes this search time. So let me tell you what resetting is. So this is a trajectory of a particle. You can think of this as a Brownian motion. So it starts from some position x naught here. It performs its Brownian dynamics, but after some time tau1, you reset it to some position xr. You just bring it to this position xr here, and after this, it again starts performing its Brownian motion, and after another time t2, you again reset it to this position xr. So you are resetting the position you are resetting the particle to some position, and this times taus after which you are performing this resetting, it is chosen from some distribution, but for the sake of my talk, I'm going to focus on this choice where taus has this sort of distribution here. And just to give you examples of where resetting may arise. For example, we know birds and animals, they return to their home after some time. They go around looking for food, but after some time they come back to their home. So this is a resetting act. Another interesting example comes up in antiviral therapies. So E here is the efficacy of a therapy, and here I've shown it as a function of time. So so this E, the efficacy changes with time, due to several reasons. But after some time, we give another dose of drug, or sometimes we change the drug itself, which will bring the efficacy to some value again. After which it again starts changing, but after another time again we supply it with another dose, which will again bring this efficacy to some value. So here also the efficacy is being reset to some value. The third example I'll tell you is on enzymatic reactions. Basically, you have an enzyme E which can bind with some substrate S to form this enzymatic complex ES, and this enzymatic complex can do two things. It can either break into enzyme and product, which is what you want. This happens with some rate, or else it could also go back to the case where there was enzyme and substrate in the unbind state. So here also this chemical reaction can reset to its initial state with some probability. So this is also an example of resetting. Okay, so I'm now going to focus on a simple model of Brownian motion with reset, and just to make things more concrete. So here this is the time evolution equation for the position. So at small time dt, the particle can do two things. It can either perform its normal dynamics, the Brownian dynamics, with some probability 1 minus r delta t, or it could reset to some position xr with probability r dt. These blue events here are the resetting events. You're bringing it to some state xr. And the question that I would like to ask is, what is the probability of finding the particle at some position x after some time t? So if I denote this probability by p, I can write an equation for the probability. This is called the Fokker-Planck equation. And if if r is equal to 0, then this particle is doing a normal Brownian motion, and in that case, the probability satisfies this diffusion equation. However, if r is non-zero, then I'm taking particle with rate r from some position to xr. So at x, the probability will decrease. This term takes care of that. And I'm taking this particle to this position xr here. So which means the probability should increase here, and this term essentially takes care of that. Okay, so as I already said, the question is to compute what the distribution is going to be in presence of resetting. And recall that when there was no resetting, the distribution had this sort of form here, and it was always in the transient state. However, the moment you turn on this rate r, if r is non-zero, then the particle goes to a stationary state. So, and this is a non-equilibrium steady state. I mean, you can show that the current is non-vanishing here. So there's a clear distinction between what happens when there's resetting with what happens when there's no resetting. So this is the first consequence of resetting, that you get a non-equilibrium steady state. The second consequence is seen in this first passage time. So this is a typical trajectory of the particle with some resetting events at these points here. And And starting from x naught, the question I would like to ask is, what is the time at which the particle reaches this origin here? So here, for example, the particle.
Prashant,
Yeah,
this is your 10-minute mark.
minutes. Okay, here particle is reaches the origin, and this is the first passage time. And when there was no resetting, this time TF had this power law distribution with diverging mean. However, when you reset the particle, the mean changes from power. I mean, the distribution changes from power law to this exponential kind of distribution here. And if you calculate the mean is now non-diverging. It has some finite value. And so this means resetting the particle will make it more efficient. So this simple act of resetting makes the particle more efficient. There's another interesting observation. First it makes this value finite, but also you can choose a value such that you can optimize this mean value here. So you can also find some R star which will optimize the value here. So this is also another interesting observation for resetting. Okay, so far I mostly focused on the Brownian motion, and I tried to convince you there are some interesting consequences due to resetting. And a natural question to ask would be, how generic are these observations? In the sense that if you go for other stochastic processes, do you get such kind of observations? So this is the question that I tried to address in my paper. I tried to address it in the context of this model called random acceleration process. Basically, it's a randomly accelerated particle. So you have this acceleration, which is random. Eta is the Gaussian white noise here. So for this model, it's well known that the distribution has this sort of form. It has Gaussian form with a t to the power cube variance, and the first passage probability also has this kind of power law form, which implies that the mean is diverging. So it has all key ingredients about the Brownian motion. Now I want to know what happens when we reset this system with some rate. Note that there are two variables here. The first one is the velocity, and the second one is this position here. So I can play around with these variables and reset one or the other. So I considered two protocols for resetting. The first one is the complete resetting, where particle and velocity both are reset with some value. So here the red trajectory is the velocity trajectory, the blue trajectory is the particle trajectory. So both of them are undergoing resetting with some rate. So this is the complete resetting. On the other hand, for partial resetting, I considered that this velocity, it evolves uninterruptedly, whereas the particle, the position is reset with some value. So this is the partial resetting. I'm only resetting the position. So for complete resetting, once again, we find that particle attains a non-equilibrium stationary state, as well as the mean is finite, and also it has some optimum value at some value of this rate. So the effects that were seen for Brownian motion are also seen when both x and v are reset. On the other hand, when there's partial resetting, where I was only resetting the position but not the velocity, those things are not seen. For example, firstly, we don't get this steady state, and the distribution has this sort of form here. This x scales diffusively with time. But I want to emphasize this scaling function is not Gaussian. It has some different form here. It's given in terms of Meiser-G functions. So it has a divergence here. But the key message is it does not lead to stationary state. This effect is also seen in the first passage properties. The mean of this first passage time is not.
Prashant, you have 1 minute.
Yeah.
You want to conclude?
Yeah. Not finite, and it has this sort of distribution here. But this exponent, 3/2 exponent, is different than 5/4 exponent, which was there for randomly accelerated particle when there was no resetting. So there are some key differences, but the sort of things that we were seeing for Brownian motion are not seen when we are partially resetting the system. Okay, so this is the conclusion. So diffusion under resetting leads to some interesting features. First is the emergence of non-equilibrium steady state. And second is the finite value of this mean first passage time, as well as for some value of rate, you can optimize this value. So this is the first thing that I tried to convince you. And second thing is how generic are these observations? And I tried to answer this in the context of randomly accelerated particle. And I showed when both X and V were resetting, where there was complete resetting, these pictures also appear here. On the other hand, when there is only partial resetting, none of these pictures hold true there. So I will leave you with a set of references and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Prashant. Maybe you can take one or two questions.
Thanks for the interesting talk. Does this position to which you reset, does that matter? Does XR matter?
Yeah, it matters in the sense that where you get this peak value. I mean, this peak essentially appears on that XR where you are resetting.
I see. Okay. And one more question. So by looking at the scaling of this average first passage time, you said something like foraging is made more efficient, for example.
Just a minute, here.
Here. Right. So here you made the conclusion that foraging is probably made more efficient.
Yeah.
So in the example of this enzymatic reaction, does that mean that if you had a rate for going back, for decomposing back, that makes the reaction more efficient?
Yeah, for some choices of this, see, there were other rates also, this K1 and K3 also. And the rate that you're talking about is this K2.
K2, yeah.
Yeah, so for some choices of K1 and K3, it has been shown that this process becomes more efficient.
With a K2?
So, yeah,
with a finite K2?
Yeah, I mean, there's condition on K2 in terms of this K1 and K3.
I see. Okay, thank you.
So my question is, from this plot, for example, you can see that from any point X, while going to XR is a sudden jump, it's a discrete jump, rather than a smooth curve in the time axis.
Here?
Yeah, so it's a discrete jump. So what is the motivation for it?
No, I mean, yeah, I mean, the motivation is analytical tractability. You can simplify many things. I mean, if you consider this, I mean, this instantaneous resetting, but there are studies where people have considered non-instantaneous resetting also. I mean, here, for example, I've directly teleported the particle to XR. Obviously, this is not physical, but I mean, there are studies. I mean, for example, when particle is here, you can turn on some trap, which will take particle to this position here. Then there, obviously, it will take non-zero time to reach this position, but those effects can be incorporated.
Wondering if, I mean, it's probably a tangential question, but do you know of ways in which, I mean, one can, let's say, speed up something like the Metropolis Hastings algorithm by using resetting? Do you know of examples of this?
In the context of some computer algorithms, people, because this first time came in those contexts only.
Sorry?
This resetting idea for the first time, I think, were popped up in the context of computer algorithms only, but I don't exactly know how, like it.
Yeah, because for instance, let's say you want to sample a very complicated underlying probability distribution and your sampler is stuck in some point where it's not, let's say, a minima of the likelihood surface. So you want to basically go back to.
Yeah, it might go in the wrong direction.
Yes. So, well, I mean, that's what, I mean, you could probably use efficient resetting proposals.
Yeah, I mean, it has been studied in those contexts.
I see. Thanks.
Hello. So like you have assumed initially that the noise is basically white noise.
Yes.
So what happens if things are like colored noise or something like
so one
those kind of.
Yeah, I mean, one example is in this active matter where the noise is colored noise. And I mean, one can do these kind of things. I mean, there will be some quantitative differences, but qualitatively this picture comes up there also.
Similar kind of.
Yeah, I mean, you have some steady state and, you know, the first passage time gets optimized at some value. This sort of picture comes up there also.
For this colored noise, you have to assume some model or something.
Yeah, I mean, so active particles are one such models where the noise is colored.
So why didn't you consider velocity only resetting protocols or something?
Sorry?
You had two of those resetting protocols, right? Where you reset either position and velocity or position alone.
Yes.
Is there a simple reason why velocity alone is not a good?
Why velocity is not reset?
Why velocity alone?
No, see, this velocity is just like Brownian motion. I mean, if you reset this velocity, then you'll get the results for Brownian motion, right? dv by dt 30 is just Brownian motion. So, I mean, maybe you can repeat your question.
No, is there no sense in which you can just reset velocity but not position? Like,
No,
or is
in
that not an
principle,
interesting thing to do?
I mean, okay, in principle that can be done, but I didn't consider that. I mean, but I would assume, I think this thing will come up there also.
And you expect there to be a steady state and so on in that
Yeah,
case?
I would expect.
Okay.
Okay. Maybe others can catch him later.
Okay, thank you so much for your questions.